Hi, friends. Welcome to Encouraged and Equipped. On this podcast, we introduce you to the women of Christ Chapel Bible Church. We share our stories to encourage and equip each other to live out our faith in Jesus. We are so glad you're here. There's no way to avoid grief in our lives. There are ways, though, to embrace and walk through loss that are healthy and good. In this episode, Cameron Ward, Kristen Hoff, and Camille Adams open up about the nearness of God in the midst of their darkest grief. They also talk about the impact of good community, the power of godly hope, and a few tips that made a difference in their loss. Here's their honest and life-giving conversation.
Hi, welcome to Encouraged and Equipped. I'm Camille Adams, and I'm here today with Cameron Ward and Kristen Hoff. Today, we're going to be talking about grief. Grief is something that, as believers, we will all experience at some point in our lives. We live in a world that is marked by sin, and because of that, we experience a wide range of things that cause us deep hurt. And so I thought it would be a great time for us to come together and share with each other some of the things that we have learned as we've walked through some deep valleys, and some of the things that give us hope as we look to our good Father who walks along with us. So I will share a little bit. I'm Camille Adams, and I have experienced grief throughout my life in different forms and fashions and different seasons. I'm currently walking through a stage of grieving my mom over time as her health is deteriorating. And so walking through a path that is unknown can always be a little scary. But I'm glad to know that I'm not alone in that the Lord is with me in that, and that I am surrounded right now by two great witnesses who are able to speak truth into my life. I know that grief can look different for different people, meaning it can come from different areas of their lives, and it can be caused by different circumstances. So I'd love to know a little bit about the two of you, if you wouldn't mind sharing a brief synopsis or story about how and what grief has looked like in your lives. Kristen, can I start with you?
Sure. Actually, I have two probably great examples to share of times when I had to walk through grief. The first time was my grandmother. I was extra close to my grandmother. In fact, she picked me up every day from junior high. So we had lots of great time together. And then she got married and moved up here. And then I shortly got married and moved up here as well. So I kind of followed her and got to hang out with her still. But she had Alzheimer's. She loved the Lord. And that was one of the things that was evident all the way until she passed. But with someone who has Alzheimer's, sometimes you may show up and they're their normal self. And then other times you show up and she would be talking to a picture frame because she thought it was communicating back to her, or she would think I was my sister, whatever. So with that, you have that grief of losing them because you don't know who you're going to see each time. And then the loss of when she actually passed. She probably had lung cancer. I'm not totally sure, but her signs and symptoms. So when she got sick, she was sick and she was in hospice for less than a week. But we got to watch her pass quickly and quietly and peacefully with the Lord. So that was great. And then my second example is probably that of my biological father. So he passed away about 3 years ago. He and I did not have a relationship at all. In fact, I hadn't seen him when he passed in probably 12 years or so. But I think the hardest part with that wasn't just his passing, because to be honest, I'd grieved that relationship probably years prior with the lack of relationship. But it was the uncertainty. Where was he? Did he know the Lord? And really also just that grief of not being able to reconcile later. I think that surprised me the most at how much it hurt.
That is a really deep loss, though, because at some point you have to think about the fact that is a really final thing. And one that I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, I don't think about that often. I don't think most people think about that as they look toward end of life issues with the people that are around them. But yeah.
Well, and in that case, I mean, you grieved twice. And, so that cyclical is hard.
Yeah. And not knowing, like, again, uncertainty, I think, is a big.
It's one of those people who were around him towards the end of his life believe that he was, but it's one of those where I would have loved to have heard it from his mouth. Like, I knew who the Lord was, and I'm certain of where I'll be when this all happens. But
I should have prefaced this by saying that it's a deep, like a great honor for me to be able to sit in here with you guys and hear these stories. And I know that, you're able to share with friends that are close to you, but it really is an honoring thing to be able to sit in a room with somebody who has experienced a hard thing and be able to hear their story. And I just wanted to say that I don't take it lightly that any of us are in this room sharing these things. But I know that I feel like I can say confidently for all three of us that the intent is to honor the Lord and to really highlight not only who he is in our high moments and when there is hope at the end of the tunnel, but to really honor him and recognize his character when those things are hard and heavy. So thank you both. Should have said it at the beginning, but I'm saying it now. Cameron, can we hear a little bit about your story?
Yeah, so I think mine begins in late 2014. My mom was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic melanoma. And so that is an internal cancer. It is does not have a cure per se. And so we began walking a road of knowing that we didn't know how much time we had, but that she would die with cancer. And, that brought a lot of grief in a lot of different places. It brought seasons of numbness and seasons of pain, of questioning. But it all came to a head in, I noticed when I came home kind of for COVID quarantine in April of 2020, okay, her stamina is really starting to dip. And I think she's having a harder time doing day-to-day things than I even knew. And that summer, I had the great privilege of walking her home to be with the Lord, the hardest and sweetest summer of my life. It really began in May when we found out that she had cancer return to her spinal cord, and we knew that if that happened again, she would not be able to do radiation because of how many times she'd done it before. And she discontinued treatment in June. And then she was very much in denial about like being in hospice care and all that stuff. And, just decided kind of things were going to be on her own terms, which was very much her. But we met with a hospice doctor on a Sunday. And on Friday morning, she went home to be with the Lord. And that Sunday, he had said, I think you probably have several weeks or, a month or so. And it really quickly, everything happened very quickly that week. And her death, like I said, was the hardest thing. But it did give me, now I can start grieving, where I had been anticipating for so long and grieving small things along the way. It, really turned the page to a whole new chapter that I thought I was prepared for, but I was ill prepared for.
I don't know that I think about this a lot, and like you said, grieving the small things along the way. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to be prayerful about and really give attention to in a way that is anticipating. Like I'm anticipating a loss that's coming. But there are also these little things, I call them little. In my mind, they're little, but I think in my mind also, sometimes they can be big. Like there are times when I would love to talk with my mom about this or that. And because she's non-communicative, she can't say anything back to me. And so that's a smaller loss. But for me, it is huge. Are there times that you have come across maybe catching yourself thinking like, I want to share my grief with this person, or I want to sit with somebody who's grieving, and maybe you've found yourself thinking, are they going to think this is like a small loss in comparison? Like, I don't want comparison to be the thing that keeps me from really sitting with somebody and ministering to them, or from sharing my story thinking that, oh, she might not see this as the same kind of loss. I think I can let comparison be an obstacle in sharing grief. Has that come up for you guys at all?
I'll let you answer first.
Yes, I think, as I've walked closely with friends through other really hard things, whether that is a breakup or, in 2020, a lot of things weren't happening for people. People were grieving not having high school graduations, not getting a normal freshman year of college. There were lots of things that people were really lamenting. And as I walked with some friends through things like that, I got often, I know this sounds so silly compared to what you're going through. And I would say to the things that seem small, it matters. Those small things that you are grieving matter, and they matter to the Lord. He is not bothered by them. And I call them grief rehearsals. So you get to decide how you are going to grieve the small things. And it's Jen Wilkin who has said, what we repeat in times of ease, we will recall in times of hardship. How you react to small losses and maybe, smaller things that you're grieving, they are training you in how to grieve the big things. So they're a good place to look in and say, am I running to the Lord with this? Am I trusting Him? Am I talking this out with other people that I trust? Nothing is too small to grieve before the Lord, and certainly be sensitive to the person that you are talking to who might be walking through something else that they're grieving. But nothing is too small, and the Lord doesn't waste it. And use those grief rehearsals.
I like that. I love that phrase, grief rehearsals.
I do too. And I think we had kind of talked about that before, but when we don't let God in to our lives for those little things, it makes it really easy when things get just a little bit bigger to try to take it in on our own power, and I can handle this. And then you end up at the bottom of that pit thinking like, oh my goodness, Lord, where are you? When it's really myself that didn't allow Him in. I didn't bring Him into the little things.
Yeah.
When those big things come along, I know I would love to think that I'm great at rehearsing grief. And I know that I am not going to do it perfectly. But I know, like when those harder moments hit, and it really is that deep grieving, and I know, like, I need to take this to the Lord. I need to lament. I know that He wants to hear me. I know that He wants to be with me, because we have a Savior who was well acquainted with grief. Like, He was called a man of sorrows. And if I can remind myself that in light of eternity, nobody has a better perspective on grief than Jesus Christ. Because He willingly came to this earth. And what a loss that was to not be in constant communication with the Father, right there in person in heaven. But also, I know that He desires to be with me in my grief because He perfectly understands. And so I think we get a good picture of what grieving looks like by looking to Jesus. But I would love to know what has encouraged you as you've lamented with the Lord. How do you lament well? How do you grieve well with the Lord when you've rehearsed it and you've done a small thing and now there's a big thing? How does that look?
I think you start with that everyday relationship. If you haven't been in communication with the Lord, it's harder to ease back into it. So it's staying in relationship with Him every day. I joke about this a lot, but I think I've told you, my showers is where I do my most lamenting. I can cry and I can pour my heart out, and then I get out of the shower and somehow my face isn't as swollen or puffy, or actually my people leave me alone because nobody wants to walk in to Mom in the shower. But I think talking about lamenting, that makes you think of David in the Psalms. And I think he was our perfect example. He spent time with the Lord. He shared his heart with the Lord. He did it respectfully. He did it in a way where he could say, hey, God, I don't understand this. This is hard. This hurts. And he would give God all of his emotions. And then he would go back and check himself. This is hard for me, yet I know you were faithful. This, makes me angry, and yet I know you hate sin just as much as I do. I mean, he constantly was going back to those attributes of God. So when you're in relationship with God and you know who he is, in the middle of that hard and that pain and, whatever it is you're dealing with, you can go back to those attributes and say, okay, this is what I'm feeling. But God, I know you, are everlasting. You love me, whatever it is that you're struggling with. And that can lift you up and helps you.
And grieving with kind of the end in mind that I will not grieve forever. I think that is the most unique thing about the Christian life. Even the insanity of Christian grief is to say, I'm not afraid to go here. I'm not afraid to go into deep swells of sorrow because I know I will not be sad forever. I read a lot when my mom was dying and in the hospital. I just stayed in Lamentations 3, which is, kind of a classic lamentation. And I could not get over this, that, this is what it says in chapter 3, starting in verse 20. My soul continually remembers it, talking about the affliction that the writer is feeling, and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. That reminded me that my mom's healing was not my portion, or the perfect circumstance was not my portion. Right. The Lord is my portion, and I will hope in him. Well, who is he? He is the God who is going to make all things new, who says in Revelation, behold, I am making all things new. He will wipe every tear from their eye, and there will be no more sadness and no more death. That is grief with deep hope. I said often, the only thing deeper than my grief is my hope. Wow. And it was my life preserver when everything else felt so dark, and only Christians get to say that. Yeah. Only Christians get to say, the Lord is my portion. I will hope, because it's only a little while actually that I'll grieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's such a great perspective. I think we can all feel like we are just totally lost in a sea of grief at times. And it can be so dark and so overwhelming. And I think for me, there's a lot of just grasping at what it really is, like a person who is drowning in the water, like grasping at whatever will keep you afloat for the next minute. But to remain steadfast and to remember that we have a life preserver, and it's not anything that I can grasp onto here in this earth. Like it is held for me steadfast in heaven.
Yes.
That's a really, really great perspective. I love that. You brought this up earlier, Cameron, and I wanted to come back to it. I know we talked about the grief rehearsals, but as we look, we know we are all going to suffer. We know we're all going to have things that come up. Do you think there's anything that can prepare you for grief or great losses? Is there anything that we can do to make ourselves ready for that?
I never could have anticipated how dark and hard grief would be. So in that respect, I'd say no. And that's
sorry, folks.
Yeah. I'll just be honest. I mean, I don't think there is anything that can, even though I had all of this time and I'd spent all this time in counseling, anticipating, talking about what it would be like when my mom died, and on and on and on. And then it happened, and I felt like I had just been totally blindsided by how I guess I had fooled myself into thinking I had a pretty good roadmap for it. And so then when it was here, I was like, this isn't going to plan. But I do think there are things you can do to buoy yourself for times that are hard. And a couple of those things are staying in the Word. Do you know who the Lord is? We are promised suffering and crisis and death. Do you have a good working theology of who the Lord is, how he hates sin and death, what he is going to do to make it right, what Christ has purchased for us? Are you in the Word? That was something that anchored me so much. And again, what we repeat in times of ease, we recall in times of hardship. For months, I could not open my Bible and read more than 4 verses at a time. I was just so dizzy with grief. And what buoyed me was the study I had done months and years before that told my heart who the Lord was and who I was in him. And then another thing is, do you have the people that will suffer it with you?
Yeah.
Once someone dies or crisis hits, it's not really the time. You don't really have the bandwidth to go really deep with people. And that's why friendship is important all of the time. I mean, even when the skies are blue and the sun's out, do you have the people that will crawl with you at your pace, that will hold you up when you can't hold yourself up, that will tell you the truth when you can't get in the Word? So I'd say those were the 2 things of knowing the Word, knowing the Lord, and then I had done work of having great friends around me who really carried me and crawled with me through the darkness.
Well, grief itself is just hard. You have that initial really, really hard part. And then when you think, oh, I've got this, I'm fine. I finally worked through it.
Oh, yeah.
It's all great.
go back
Something
to the
shows up and you're like, wait, why am I feeling this all over again? And it could be good things. It can be bad things. It could be, I don't know, the sky is blue today and the sun is shining. Just sometimes you wake up and all of a sudden, you start all back over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's so wise to go ahead and build that community for many reasons, like you said. We all need to build community for many reasons. We were not meant to do this alone, any of this alone. But I do think this is a different idea of how do we grieve within community? Like, how do you not only build the community around you that will, like you said, crawl with you, walk with you, be with you, even on those days where you're like, I have no idea why I spent the last hour and a half like sitting in my car crying, but I just did. And that's how cyclical grief works sometimes. Friends who will understand that, but also like, how do we grieve within that community? Like, how do you incorporate those people that God has put in your life as you're walking that road?
For me, it looked like I had one friend. I was finishing my last year of college right after my mom died. And I had one friend who walked with me and at the slowest pace ever. And she got my honest answers about, how are you doing today? Are you sleeping? There was a significant amount of kind of trauma that was associated with my mom dying, and that I didn't realize until several months later. And so she became the one who was like, are you sleeping? Are you eating? Hey, do you need me to do your laundry because your hamper's overflowing? Those sorts of things that I explicitly gave her permission to do those things. And she explicitly said back to me, I will not leave. I will walk this road with you no matter how hard it is. And so our friendship was pretty strong beforehand, but for us, for that friendship in particular, it looked like kind of explicit permission giving on both sides, where I knew that I was free to bring whoever I was that day to the table, and she knew that she would get my honest answers. There were a lot of people that were very well-meaning that would ask, how are you doing? And I'd be like, I'm doing okay, because I just didn't have the energy.
Right.
And you don't need to go deep with everyone. And not everyone needs to be the community that you grieve with.
Right.
So at least for me, that was how it looked of, you ask and I'll tell you.
And you pointed it out. You had that relationship before. When my dad passed, there was a good friend of mine that I went to, and she was someone who was wise, who was mature in her faith, and I could go to her and just totally tell her everything that was on my heart, tell her what was going on, all of the different ways that this was a huge, complete mess. And she sat there and she listened, and then she asked how I was, and then she said, okay, how is God working in this?
Yep.
Yeah.
Where do you see the Lord moving? What do you think God, just totally pointing me back to truth, where I would have sat in that ocean, probably treading water for who knows how long. And instead, she gave me those gentle pushes that I needed to point me back to what would actually sustain me.
Yeah.
And I will say, too, I think that there's a part of what we've both talked about is kind of one person that was very close to us that asked hard questions, and that we said things out loud that were terrifying and just so heavy.
Yeah.
And there is a time like now where we get to sit around and our grief becomes part of our ministry.
Yeah.
That time is probably not right after the crisis has hit.
Right.
Grieve closely, grieve deeply. Not everyone needs to know. And honestly, you don't need to tell everyone about those deep places.
Right.
Take that, keep it close, take it to the Lord. There will come a time where you can share, but you're probably not seeing straight in the beginning, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've talked around this a lot, and I want to know, because I think this is such a great opportunity for us to really highlight the Lord's character. But what are, now that you're able to look back a little bit, what are some of those things that you learned about the Lord's character as you walked through grief? That's it. That's the question. It sounded like there was more, but that was it.
Well, and part of me wants to think, because I think that list is much longer than I would ever be able to share.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I think first and foremost is that this is not what God wanted us to do. Like, his plan was not for death and sorrow and grief. And yet we chose sin, and that's what led us on this path.
Yeah.
And so you learn through things like this that God is merciful.
Yep.
He is gracious. He is loving. He is, he is your peace. He is your joy. He is what lifts you up whenever you can't lift up on your own. Really, I could probably go all day. I'm trying to, I feel like I'm missing like 500 others. But when you go back to his word, I think 1 Peter 5:10 was one of the things that sustained me, especially after my grandmother passed away. And it says, when you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. He's that rock. He is, your shelter. He's your strong place. All of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think most of my prayers and grief and most of my talking with God was just saying, I am so sad.
Yeah.
I am heartbroken. I never knew I could be so heartbroken. And what I learned of him there was that was okay. And my prayers were not elaborate, and they were not beautiful. Yet he was gentle with me. He was gracious and patient. I had a lot of guilt being in my senior year of college and thinking, I took a semester off, and I thought, I need to leverage this time and disciple other people. And I remember trying to meet with this girl, and she had kind of asked me to disciple her. And she's talking, and we're very early in our relationship, and I am just like going cross-eyed. I'm like, I have no idea what you're saying. I have no idea how to respond. Like, I went home and just went straight to bed for 3 hours, and I was like, that was exhausting. And in some places, I felt a lot of guilt for that I wasn't doing enough, that I wasn't using my grief as ministry, on and on. And I saw just how gentle the Lord was with me, that, like a little lamb on his shoulders, like my leg was broken and it was very badly broken, and that was okay. I saw that he hates sin and death more than I do, like you were saying, Kristen, that he hates it so much that he sent Christ to take the penalty for our sin and to defeat death, and that he has promised to defeat death forever. That justice side of him was very comforting to me, because everything in me was just saying, it's not supposed to be this way. Right. This is wrong. And to then entrust myself to a God who's going to make it all right, was a wonderful side of his character for me to get to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Sometimes I can't get over the fact that I used to have a Post-it right here and it got ripped off, but I remember it when I look at my computer every time, and it says, his presence is comfort. And after I suffered a miscarriage, that was the one thing that I found, that like the Lord is near to the brokenhearted. And boy, was I brokenhearted.
Yeah.
I mean, just on the floor, on my face. And the fact that in my head, I can picture it now. I'm like, wow, I must have just looked so wretched laying on my floor in the bathroom, just weeping. And none of that caused the Lord to draw away from me. In fact, it drew me to him. Yeah. And the fact that he thought about that ahead of time and knew that I would be brokenhearted, and said in his word that he was going to be there with me, that is comfort.
Yeah.
Yeah. Comfort doesn't come from somebody saying it's going to be okay or this is going to work out in the end. Comfort comes from the nearness of the Lord.
Yep.
And what a great God that we get to follow in those difficult times.
And when we feel like we're alone, I think the sad part is it's because he's right there beside us saying, but you don't have to be. Please turn to me. Let me in.
Absolutely. And there's a basket full of fruit that comes at the end of that. And I think it's hard to not focus on, oh, I want this to be over so I can have that fruit at the end. The good part comes in the middle when we build that relationship and that trust with the Lord over time. But I love that he gives us those stories while we walk through those things with him. Do you think that it's possible to sin in our grief? And by that I mean, we've talked about grieving well, we've talked about praying, we've talked about the nearness of the Lord, but we are not going to do it well 100% of the time. So do you think that it's possible that we can grieve not well?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. And
You could ask my kids that, and they would be, I guess.
remember when you did? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Especially with kind of this individualistic culture that we're in, and the narrative that we all grieve differently. The truth in that statement is that, Camille, you might grieve by going on a run. That might be how you deal with what you're feeling that day. And I might grieve by gardening. Or you might be in denial and I might be angry. And it's okay for us to be in a different stage of grief. That is what it means that we all grieve differently.
Okay.
It is possible, totally, to sit in grief if we are not thinking about how we are acting, about how we are representing Christ, how we're treating others, those sorts of things. It's totally possible that we can sin. Grief is not a license to act however you want or to behave in whichever way you're feeling that day and let the people around you pick up the pieces and just say, well, I'm grieving and that's just the way it is. And I think most of us would say, I would never do that. But the reality is that, we are having a hard day and we're snappy, or we make a decision that maybe we know wasn't very wise, and we say, you have no idea how hard this has all been on me, and I just needed this one thing.
Right.
And we can totally sin in grief, and it matters. I've said a lot. It matters how Christians grieve. We need to grieve with hope, but we also need to grieve with honor toward others and the Lord.
Well, and when you're not walking with the Lord, it's really easy to turn to things that are not the Lord. So do I, partake of a drink, or do I do this thing, or do I do this thing? When we're not turning to the Lord and we're turning to material things or earthly things or, whatever that is sinful, because we are called to lean on the Lord and not on whatever other things might numb us or make us feel better for just that little bit.
Yeah, that is a huge temptation, I know, for me, just to think about well, I saw so-and-so grieving and that was really helpful for them. So probably I should start doing this weird, wacky thing that in reality, I know is not. It's just going to delay my grief, if nothing else.
I'll just be neglectful and sit on my couch and binge Netflix all day long and ignore my kids, not do my laundry, that's still sinful.
Or I think for a lot of women, I've kind of seen two things pop up as ways that they can cope in unhealthy ways, and especially for Christian women, I think we really need to think about is one is busyness, getting really busy, and just being I just need to take my mind off of this. And you might there might be a point where you need to get out and do something just to feel normal and to feel human and to take your mind off of it. But are you doing it to avoid the depths of grief and maybe where the Lord would have you go so that he can meet you there? And shopping is actually another one that I see a lot of. Think about how you're stewarding not only your finances, but also your emotions and in your experience. Yeah. How are you stewarding your grief? Are you stewarding it in a way that honors the Lord, or that just puts a Band-Aid on a gaping wound?
Well, and I think it's hard too. I think God gives us times of sorrow and times of grief, or he lets us experience them. He doesn't necessarily give it to us, but he lets us experience those to remind us of our brokenness.
Yeah, right.
When we remember that we are broken and we do need a Savior who's going to carry us around on his shoulders, it reminds us that we have this better promise, that we do have this hope. So when we are coping in other ways, we're not remembering how great our God actually is.
In reality, we're thinking about it that way. We're robbing ourselves of that closeness that we could be having with him. And
just think how fast we could get through with it. Let me do it the easy way and stay with God instead of running away and doing all the other things that make me numb.
Oh my goodness. If there was a way to speed it up, we would make $1 million. That's not really the purpose of it.
And my book will be coming out later.
There's no Amazon Prime to this. No. It's only USPS mail.
And it's going to be really delayed, probably. Yeah. Oh, goodness.
It'll be delayed till Jesus comes back and takes us home.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the sides of grief that, I'll be honest, I struggle with anger in lots of ways, and there's a whole other episode of podcast about that specifically. But I think in the realm of suffering, loss, and grieving, anger is going to come up. And so has that been something that you've done well? Have you seen somebody do it well? Have you yourselves done it in a way that was wow, I learned a lot about who I am because of how I grieved that and came through that anger on the other side of it? How has anger looked for you in your grief?
I have a mentor and a dear friend who also lost her mom in college to cancer. And she helped me really think about those places where I felt anger. What am I really angry at? What is the Lord also angry at? If I am angry that death is something we experience and grief is something we experience, well, good news, so is the Lord. And he is the one who has the power to make it all new. And so that was a rightfully placed loathing of death.
Yes.
There were other things that I had a period where I felt And I knew it was irrational, but I felt angry at my mom for abandoning me. There were a lot of really hard things that happened in the wake of her death, and I felt like, how could you leave me? And I'm just here to pick up the pieces. And my mentor really helped me, think about, what are you actually angry at here? And every time it came back to, I'm angry at death, that this is something we experience. So there is a way to kind of gauge your anger and to say, is this something the Lord also expresses anger over in the scriptures? And if not, maybe I need to dig a little bit deeper, or, ask for forgiveness on this. Yeah, the anger part is hard, and especially, again, for women.
Right.
It's a hard piece and can be very tricky in grief because it can mask itself as other things.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. When I'm angry, I get irritable or snappy or, just not very kind. I think anger is a hard one because it comes and it goes and it shows up when you least expect it. And for me, the way I've seen it tied to grief is really that loss of expectations. Like, this is what my plan was. And when I emailed God that plan, he didn't follow it. And so now I'm walking this other path, and those expectations have all, been shattered. And that's hard because, that happens with our little griefs from, did my kid get picked for the right school, to my husband should have treated me this way, and this was how I had pictured this whole thing in my head, and he obviously didn't get the same picture, and that comes out, I think, in everything.
Yeah.
It'll make you snappy at like Christmas.
Yes.
Yes.
And you show up to Christmas Eve and you're just raging, and you're like, I don't know why, actually. And it'll just, like you said, Kristen, it just comes out of the blue and can really surprise you if you're not ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one of those things to practice rehearsing grief early on comes in handy to be able to recognize those signs that it's coming, if you can, if there are signs.
And then learn how to apologize.
Yes.
Because we're not all going to do this perfect. We're not going to keep ourselves, with a nice mouth and demeanor all the time. And so when we do falter, it's okay to go back and tell those that we love, like, okay, I was a crazy lady and I should not have done that. I should not have said those things. And I will do my best to do better, and, walk with me, pull them in and let them have that person that holds you accountable.
And it's okay, to say, hey, I totally fumbled this.
Yep.
And likely if you'll own it, they'll say, yeah, I've never done this either. And, we've never grieved this thing before. And so, owning it can be really healing for both of you.
Yep.
That's good. Are there any other things that you would want to share with somebody who is walking into a period of grief or in the middle of their grief, as you think about things that were helpful for you or things that you wish you would have known? Is there anything that you would want to share wisdom-wise that would be great for somebody to hear?
I'd say there's no way out but through.
Yeah.
And that also doesn't sound very encouraging, but it's honest. And there is no shortcut. There is no way around it. You're just gonna have to walk through it. And sometimes you walk in and you know that you're walking into it. And sometimes in the blink of an eye, you find yourself there. And either way, there is no way out but through. You're just going to have to go into those valleys. And one thing I think something that has been very encouraging for me is in Psalm 23, where it talks about the valley of the shadow of death. I will fear no evil. Well, shadows are fleeting. There is coming a day where our King himself will be our light. There will be no need for a sun because his face will be our light, and you will not stay in the shadows forever. Our hope is, like 1 Peter 1 says, kept in heaven for us, undefiled, unfading, imperishable. There is no way out but through. Yet you have great, deep hope. And some days that will be just a tiny blip beacon on the horizon. Just keep looking. Just keep looking. It won't last forever.
Yeah.
Well, and I was going to say that it may not have a specific end date. I think a lot of times when we approach grief, we're like, okay, so the typical grief period is 6 months. So in 6 months, I will wake up and be completely better.
Yep.
It doesn't really always work that way. And I think as far as grief goes, sometimes it gets better versus just stops. And so you have those days when you feel kind of normal and whatever, and then it pops back up. And it's just going back to remember, the Lord does not want this. He has already made this path for me, and I have that hope and that future. And I think that's the best thing to turn to.
Yeah.
One of the things I've heard that I think hits the nail on the head is that grief does not get easier. It just gets different.
Yeah.
And that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah. I think it's so a good practice for us to be into as well, to fill ourselves up with these things, because I know the thing that is not helpful is to hear things that are not true.
Yep.
The truth is the thing that will always bring restoration and healing and reconciliation. And those are things that we hope for when we are in the midst of loss. And so the last thing I want is for us to give out a platitude instead of the real and abiding and living hope that we have in Jesus Christ. Because, like you said, this is not like maybe I'll experience this. It's
You will.
You will.
Yeah.
And it will be hard, and it will change you. And let's make sure that it changes us so that we are becoming more and more like our Savior by the grace of God. Thank you guys. I cannot tell you how immensely honored I am that you're willing to sit and talk with me about grief and your stories. It's really been, can I say it's a joy? Are we allowed to say it's a joy at the end of a grief podcast? But it really has been. And so I will pray and close our time and thank God for the good gift of your friendship. Lord, thank you for your nearness. We thank you for being a God who sees us. You see our joys and our delights. You know us deeply, and you see when we are deep in a field of loss. And you come to us. You don't tarry. You never fail. Your love is perfect in that it meets us in those hardships, and it fills us with the hope that you are near, you are coming back, Lord Jesus, and that you will make all things new in your perfect timing. I thank you for these beautiful women and for the stories that you have knit together in their lives of redemption and grace and power and joy. We ask that your words would be the first thing that come to our minds when we are grieving, and that they would be the things that sustain us. We ask all these things in the beautiful name of our Savior, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.